Sometimes life throws you curveballs that shatter everything you thought you knew about your world. Sarah Mitchell was about to discover that the man she'd mourned for 3 years wasn't quite as dead as she'd believed, and the truth would transform her from a grieving widow into the strongest version of herself she'd never known existed. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows of Sarah's modest apartment as she stirred her coffee, mentally preparing for what she hoped would be a peaceful Saturday. At 34, she'd finally started to feel like herself again after the devastating loss of her husband Marcus 3 years earlier. The grief counseling had helped, and recently, she'd even started dating again, something that would have seemed impossible during those dark months after the funeral. "Today's the day," she whispered to herself, glancing at the elegant wedding invitation propped against her fruit bowl. Her college friend Jessica was getting married at the historic Riverside Manor, and Sarah had promised to attend. It would be her first wedding since Marcus's death, and while the thought made her stomach flutter with nervous energy, she knew it was another important step in her healing journey. Sarah had chosen her outfit carefully, a flowing navy dress that Marcus had always complimented her in, paired with the pearl earrings her grandmother had left her. She wanted to look put together but not overdressed, supportive but not attention-seeking. As she applied her makeup, she caught her reflection's eye in the mirror and smiled. For the first time in years, she actually felt genuinely excited about socializing and celebrating someone else's happiness. The drive to Riverside Manor took 45 minutes through winding country roads lined with autumn maples. Sarah found herself humming along to the radio, another small sign of the progress she'd made. Music had been too painful for the first year after Marcus's death. Every song seemed to carry memories that would send her spiraling into tears. Now she could appreciate the beauty of a melody without drowning in the past. As she pulled into the sprawling parking lot of the historic venue, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. "Running late with hair and makeup. Ceremony moved to 4 p.m. instead of 3 p.m. Sorry for the short notice." Sarah glanced at her dashboard clock. 2:30 p.m. She had time to kill, but that was fine. The grounds were beautiful, and she could use a peaceful walk to center herself before facing a room full of couples and celebration. She'd learned that weddings could be emotional triggers, and she wanted to be mentally prepared to handle whatever feelings might surface. The venue was even more stunning than the photos on their website suggested. Riverside Manor sat majestically on a hill overlooking a meandering creek, its stone facade covered in ivy that had turned brilliant shades of red and gold. Gardens stretched in every direction, with winding paths that invited exploration. Sarah decided to walk the grounds until it was time to check in for Jessica's ceremony. As she strolled through the rose garden, she noticed that the venue seemed to be hosting multiple events. A small group of people in formal attire was gathered near the East Garden Pavilion, while another wedding party appeared to be setting up in the main ballroom, visible through the tall windows. Sarah smiled to herself, thinking how romantic it must be to have multiple couples starting their forever stories in such a beautiful place on the same day. At 3:45, Sarah made her way toward what she assumed was the correct ceremony location, following a small crowd dressed in wedding attire. The invitation had mentioned the Garden Pavilion, and she could see white chairs arranged in neat rows facing a gorgeous floral arch. The late afternoon light filtered through the trees, creating an almost magical atmosphere that would have taken Marcus's breath away. He'd always been sentimental about beautiful moments like this. Sarah found a seat near the back, not recognizing anyone around her, which struck her as odd since she'd expected to see some mutual friends from college. But Jessica had always been social, and Sarah figured she simply didn't know this particular group. She pulled out her phone to double-check the details on the invitation and noticed she had a missed call from Jessica, but the ceremony music was beginning, so she quickly silenced her phone and settled in to watch. The processional began with the typical lineup of bridesmaids in elegant blush-colored gowns, followed by what appeared to be the maid of honor in a deeper rose shade. Sarah found herself getting emotional, as she always did at weddings, thinking about her own ceremony with Marcus 8 years ago. They'd promised each other forever, never imagining that forever would be cut so tragically short by a car accident that still didn't feel real most days. As the wedding march began and the bride appeared at the end of the aisle, Sarah felt her chest tighten with bittersweet emotion. The bride was radiant in classic white lace, her face glowing with happiness that was almost infectious. Sarah wiped away a tear, grateful that she could now witness such joy without being completely overwhelmed by her own loss. But then the bride reached the altar, and Sarah's world tilted off its axis. Standing there in a perfectly tailored charcoal tuxedo, with the same warm smile she'd fallen in love with 12 years ago, was Marcus, her Marcus, her dead husband, alive, breathing, and apparently about to marry someone else. The blood drained from Sarah's face so quickly that she gripped the back of the chair in front of her to keep from falling. This had to be a hallucination. Grief-induced psychosis. A breakdown she hadn't seen coming, because Marcus Mitchell had died 3 years ago in a car accident on Route 95. She'd identified his body. She'd planned his funeral. She'd buried him in Oakwood Cemetery and visited his grave every month since. But there he stood, 20 feet away from her, taking the hands of a woman Sarah had never seen before, while an officiant began speaking about love and commitment and forever promises. Sarah's breathing became shallow and rapid. The edges of her vision started to blur, and she realized she was having a panic attack in the middle of someone else's wedding ceremony. Several people around her were starting to notice her distress, but she couldn't focus on their concerned expressions. Her entire reality had just shattered like glass hitting concrete. "Marcus," she whispered, though no sound came out. As if he'd heard her silent call, Marcus's eyes swept across the seated guests during a pause in the ceremony. His gaze landed on Sarah, and his face went completely white. For a moment that stretched like eternity, they stared at each other across the garden pavilion. The supposedly dead husband and the widow who'd spent 3 years learning to live without him. Marcus's hands began to shake visibly. The bride noticed something was wrong and followed his stare, her own expression shifting from blissful joy to confusion as she tried to understand why her groom looked like he'd seen a ghost. "Marcus?" the bride whispered, loud enough for the first few rows to hear. "What's wrong?" But Marcus couldn't speak. He was staring at Sarah with the expression of a man whose carefully constructed world was collapsing in real time. Sarah stood up slowly, her legs trembling but somehow supporting her weight. The movement drew more attention, and a ripple of confused murmurs began spreading through the crowd. The officiant paused mid-sentence, clearly sensing that something significant was happening, but not understanding what. "Excuse me," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. "I think there's been a mistake." Every eye in the pavilion turned toward her. The bride's family members were exchanging worried glances, probably wondering if they were witnessing a mental health crisis or some kind of disruption they'd need to handle. But Sarah's focus was entirely on Marcus, whose face had now shifted from shock to what looked unmistakably like guilt. "Marcus," Sarah said, louder this time, "I think we need to talk." The bride turned fully toward Marcus, her bouquet trembling in her hands. "Do you know this woman?" Marcus opened his mouth, closed it, then looked back at Sarah with an expression she'd never seen before. Caught, trapped, finally exposed after years of what was clearly an elaborate deception. Marcus began, his voice cracking. "I can explain." "Explain what?" the bride demanded, her voice rising with panic. "Marcus, who is this woman?" Sarah took a deep breath and stepped into the aisle. She'd spent 3 years in therapy learning to find her voice, to advocate for herself, to recognize her own worth. She thought those skills were about moving forward from loss, but apparently they were about to be tested in a way she'd never imagined. "I'm Sarah Mitchell," she announced to the stunned crowd. "And 3 years ago, I buried my husband Marcus Mitchell after what I was told was a fatal car accident." She looked directly at the bride. "The man you're about to marry is my legally wedded husband, who apparently decided it was easier to fake his death than ask for a divorce." The pavilion erupted in gasps and shocked whispers. The bride's bouquet fell to the ground as she turned to stare at Marcus with growing horror. Several people pulled out their phones, either to call for help or capture what was clearly going to be a viral moment. "That's impossible," the bride said, shaking her head. "Marcus, tell her she's wrong. Tell everyone she's confused or lying or..." But Marcus wasn't denying anything. He was standing frozen at the altar, watching his two worlds collide in the most public way possible. Sarah walked slowly down the aisle, every step feeling like a reclamation of power she'd forgotten she possessed. 3 years ago, I got a call saying you'd been in an accident. A police officer came to my door with your wallet and wedding ring. I identified what I was told was your body at the morgue." Her voice grew stronger with each word. "I planned your funeral. I gave a eulogy about what a wonderful husband you were. I grieved for you. I went to therapy to learn how to live without you." She stopped at the front row, close enough to see the sweat beading on Marcus's forehead. "I even felt guilty about starting to date again, because I thought I was betraying your memory." The bride, whose name Sarah still didn't know, looked between them with growing understanding and fury. "Are you telling me that you're married to 2 women? That you faked your death to get out of your first marriage?" Marcus finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Sarah, I can explain everything. You don't understand." "Then explain," Sarah interrupted, crossing her arms. Explain to everyone here how you managed to fake a car accident convincing enough to fool the police. Explain how you got a death certificate issued. Explain how you've been living under the same name while being legally dead. She gestured to the bride. Explain to this woman how you convinced her to marry someone who's already married. The weight of the question seemed to crush whatever composure Marcus had been clinging to. His shoulders sagged, and he looked around at the faces staring at him. Wedding guests who'd come to celebrate love and instead were witnessing the exposure of elaborate fraud. I never meant for it to go this far, he said quietly. Which part? Sarah demanded. The fake death? The bigamy? Or the part where you let me believe I was a widow for 3 years? The bride stepped forward, her wedding dress rustling with the sharp movement. How long have we been together, Marcus? 2.5 years, he admitted without meeting her eyes. Sarah felt a bitter laugh escape her throat. So you started dating her 6 months after your fake death. How romantic. The bride's hand flew to her mouth. Oh my God, you were cheating on her. That's why you faked your death instead of just getting divorced. You were already with me. The pieces were falling into place, and Marcus's guilt was written across his face like a confession. Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. Not the crushing pain she'd expected, but something that felt almost like relief. For 3 years, she'd blamed herself for not being enough to keep Marcus happy, for not seeing signs that their marriage was in trouble, for somehow failing as a wife. Now she understood that the failure had been entirely his. I loved you, she said to Marcus, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. I would have worked on our marriage if you told me you were unhappy. I would have gone to counseling, made changes, tried to fix whatever was broken between us. Instead, you chose to destroy my entire life just to avoid an uncomfortable conversation. Marcus finally looked at her directly. Sarah, you have to understand. No, she interrupted. I don't have to understand anything. What I understand is that while I was attending grief support groups and learning how to sleep alone in our bed, you were building a new life with someone else. What I understand is that you let me suffer through the worst pain of my life rather than take responsibility for your own choices. She turned to address the bride, whose own world was clearly crumbling. I'm sorry this is how you're finding out, but you should know that this man is capable of deception on a level that most people can't even imagine. If he could fake his own death to avoid a difficult conversation, what else is he capable of lying about? The bride was now crying, streaks of mascara running down her cheeks. We have a house together. We have joint bank accounts. How is any of this legal if you're still married to her? It's not, Sarah said gently. None of it is legal. The marriage license you signed isn't valid. Any contracts you've entered into together are fraudulent. You're not married to a dead man. You're the victim of someone who's committed multiple felonies. Around them, the wedding guests were pulling out phones, some making calls that sounded like they were contacting lawyers or police. The officiant had quietly stepped away, clearly recognizing that this ceremony was not going to be completed. Marcus seemed to realize that his years of deception were finally catching up with him. I know how this looks, he said desperately, but I can fix this. We can work this out privately. The way you worked out our marriage privately? Sarah asked. By faking your death and committing fraud? By making me believe I was a widow while you started a new life 20 miles away? She shook her head. There's no working this out privately, Marcus. You've committed crimes, multiple crimes, and more importantly, you've traumatized 2 women who trusted you. For the first time since this surreal confrontation began, Sarah felt the full power of her own transformation. 3 years of therapy had taught her to recognize manipulation, to trust her instincts, and to value her own worth. 3 years of rebuilding her life had made her stronger than she'd ever been when she was married to Marcus. I spent 3 years thinking I wasn't enough to keep you alive, she continued, her voice carrying clearly through the silent pavilion. I blamed myself for not seeing that you were unhappy. I wondered if I could have prevented your accident somehow. I carried guilt that nearly destroyed me. She straightened her shoulders, but it was never about me not being enough. It was about you being too much of a coward to have an honest conversation. The bride had stopped crying and was now staring at Marcus with what looked like disgust. 3 years, she said slowly. You let her suffer for 3 years because you couldn't admit you wanted out of your marriage? Marcus tried to reach for her, but she stepped back. Don't touch me. Don't ever touch me again. Sarah pulled out her phone and began dialing. I'm calling the police, she announced. Faking your death is fraud. Filing false police reports is a crime. Bigamy is illegal. And I'm pretty sure there are insurance fraud implications here too, since I assume you had life insurance policies. Sarah, please, Marcus begged. Think about what this will do to both of you. The media attention, the legal mess. The legal mess you created, Sarah corrected. And you know what? I'm not afraid of media attention anymore. I'm not ashamed of being the victim of your deception. The only person who should be ashamed is you. As she waited for the police dispatcher to answer, Sarah felt a strange sense of closure washing over her. The man she'd mourned didn't exist. He'd never existed. The Marcus she'd fallen in love with, married, and grieved for had been a carefully constructed fiction. The real Marcus was a coward who'd chosen the most elaborate possible way to avoid taking responsibility for his own unhappiness. 911, what's your emergency? I need to report multiple crimes, Sarah said clearly. I'm at Riverside Manor, and I've just discovered that my husband, who I believe died 3 years ago, faked his death and is currently attempting to marry another woman. This involves fraud, bigamy, and filing false police reports. As she provided the details to the dispatcher, Sarah noticed that wedding guests were beginning to leave, many of them on their own phones, probably calling family members to share the most unbelievable wedding story they'd ever witnessed. The bride had sat down in the front row and was being comforted by what appeared to be her maid of honor and mother. When Sarah hung up the phone, she found Marcus staring at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. I never wanted to hurt you, he said quietly. But you did hurt me, Sarah replied. You devastated me. You made me question everything about myself and our relationship. You put me through 3 years of unnecessary grief. She paused, then added, but you also accidentally gave me the greatest gift possible. Marcus frowned. What do you mean? You forced me to discover how strong I actually am, Sarah said. You made me learn to live without you. And it turns out I'm pretty amazing at it. I've built a life I'm proud of. I've become someone I actually like. And now I know that the man I thought I'd lost was never worth having in the first place. The sound of sirens could be heard in the distance, growing closer. Marcus looked around desperately, as if considering whether he could somehow escape this situation, but there was nowhere to run. His carefully constructed double life was over. Sarah turned to the bride, who was watching the conversation with a mixture of shock and what might have been admiration. I'm sorry your wedding day turned out like this, but I promise you, finding out now is better than finding out 5 years from now with kids involved. The bride nodded slowly. Thank you, she said quietly. I can't believe I'm saying this, but thank you for stopping this. As police cars pulled into the parking lot of Riverside Manor, Sarah felt lighter than she had in years. Not just because the mystery of Marcus's supposed death had been solved, but because she'd discovered something important about herself. She was no longer the woman who would stay silent to avoid conflict. She was no longer someone who would question her own worth based on other people's actions. She was Sarah Mitchell, and she was strong enough to handle whatever life threw at her, even accidentally attending her supposedly dead husband's wedding to another woman. The police officers who approached the pavilion looked like they'd never encountered a situation quite like this one. As Sarah began explaining the circumstances that had led to this moment, she realized that this bizarre, traumatic, surreal experience would probably become the story that defined her transformation from victim to survivor. And for the first time since she'd walked into that pavilion, Sarah Mitchell smiled. Because sometimes the most unexpected moments reveal exactly who you've become when you weren't paying attention. And sometimes the worst betrayal imaginable turns out to be the liberation you never knew you needed. Marcus was about to face the consequences of his elaborate deception. The bride was about to start the difficult process of untangling her life from someone who'd lied about his very existence. And Sarah was about to go home to her beautiful, honest life, knowing that she'd never have to wonder what if about the man she thought she'd lost. As she gave her statement to the police, Sarah thought about the wedding invitation that had brought her here. She'd have to call Jessica later to explain why she'd missed the actual ceremony, but she had a feeling that Jessica would understand that sometimes you accidentally end up exactly where you need to be, even when you think you're going somewhere completely different. 3 years ago, Marcus Mitchell's supposed death had shattered Sarah's world. Today, discovering that he was alive had put all the pieces back together in a way that was stronger and more beautiful than anything that had come before. Sometimes the best thing that can happen to you is discovering that the life you thought you wanted was built on lies, because only then can you build something real. What do you think about Sarah's incredible discovery? Sometimes the most painful revelations turn out to be the greatest gifts. Have you ever found strength in a situation that seemed devastating at first? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Stories like Sarah's remind us that we're often stronger than we know, and that the truth, however painful, is always better than living a lie. Don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories of transformation and resilience.